Hello and welcome to a discussion on scholarly writing. And what I'll share in this discussion is how I go from essentially an assignment or a topic to pretty close to a rough draft. So this is not intended to be a replacement for any kind of instruction you might receive elsewhere, but it's basically just a few tips, a few hints that have worked out for me. To start with, there's this general concept that I've seen over and over again in this type of writing, and that's basically you introduce something, you talk about it, and then you wrap things up and move on to the next thing. That applies to the entire paper. So every paper you write should start with an introduction section that will include kind of what is the point of the paper. That's the thesis statement. It should say why you're writing the paper and why the person reading it should read it. And then it should continue to say what you're going to talk about to address or speak to that topic, so that thesis statement. And then also at the very end, after you've done the body, you've explained everything to explain, you wrap it up with a conclusion. You restate the thesis statement essentially in past tense, saying that you addressed it as well by enumerating those topics you talked about. And then lastly, you typically want to wrap it up with some sort of a takeaway, a high-level thing that you would like the reader to remember about the paper, so that if someone were to ask them, what's the point of that, they could answer the question in a succinct way. And also, what did you learn from it? And so that's kind of the basic idea. That same pattern, though, of introduction, content, conclusion applies inside of the sections inside of your paper. So if you're using headings to organize the content inside of your paper, which is a good idea, especially as you go greater than maybe a page or so, it applies there as well. So whenever you start a new section, you should introduce what that section's about with a very brief sort of discussion, and then you go into the content inside of that section, and then you should wrap up the section and move on before moving on to the next section. And if for some reason you were to use headings inside of, or subheadings inside of your headings, you would do something similar inside of there as well. This concept also applies down to the paragraph level. We have this concept of a topic sentence, which is the point of the paragraph. That's essentially the introduction. You say what the point of the paragraph is, basically what is the main thing that you're going to talk about. You introduce some evidence, maybe do some analysis, something to support whatever it was the point of that paragraph is, and then you should wrap it up with a final sentence that basically kind of concludes what the concept is and ideally prepares the reader for the next paragraph. And it's very much a recursive pattern. So it's something to think about in general whenever you're writing. And it will be a journey for a lot of people. But the only way you get better is by practice, trying new things, and then getting feedback along the way. So whenever you're given an assignment, the first thing to do is take a look and make sure that you're going to understand it, obviously. And then make sure that you capture all the parts of that assignment in your paper. I do that a lot of times by at the point that I go through and read the assignment, I actually enumerate my outline or my sections inside of my paper at that point so that I know what I'm going to talk about. You can go to the trouble of creating a rough sort of outline if you want to, or you can go straight to writing it in the paper. It's really up to you. It's whatever works better. Personally, I kind of skip the outline step and go straight into the headings inside of my paper. So assuming you're writing inside of APA, which most people are in the universities I'm engaged with, you start with these high-level points being your heading level ones. And if you were writing an outline, you would include in your outline introduction and a conclusion as bullets in your outline. If you're doing it inside of your actual paper, keep in mind that in APA, there's no introduction heading. The first paragraph or section that is after the title on the first page of content is assumed to be the introduction. So you don't have to say this is the introduction. The reader knows it because it's coming right after the title. But you should include typically a conclusion section with a conclusion heading, assuming there's more than one section inside of your paper. If there's not at least another section inside of the paper, so another heading level 1, you might want to omit the conclusion heading. If you do make a claim, so you make some statement of fact that is beyond what is generally accepted in the art, then you should support that claim with a citation. You cite on the first sentence in that you use a source, not at the end of the paragraph inside of APA. So in some other types of citation, you cite at the very end of the paragraph. That's not APA. In APA, it is the first time that you use a given source in a paragraph, you put a citation on that sentence. So assuming you have this assignment, you've been given an assignment to write 300 to 400 words discussing IT security policy implementations. You're also told that you should define the concepts and provide the major elements, and then describe the importance and include challenges faced during implementation, and you need at least 3 sources. So from that, you have kind of a rough idea of what it is you need to do. You've got essentially your thesis statement, which is that you're going to define and explore the challenges, including the challenges that are faced during adoption of IT security policies. Not the most riveting thesis statement, but that is the thesis statement. And then your outline is basically introduction, definition of major elements, importance, and then challenges faced during implementation and conclusion. You could split definition and major elements apart, or you could do them together. It's really up to you. Either would work, but that's roughly what the outline would look like. And then at this point, I typically start thinking about, what am I going to call this? Don't call it, assignment number 1 or something. Call it something that is descriptive enough that if you were to put it on a blog post, somebody could tell what it's about before they actually have to read it. So don't use the name of the assignment as the title. Rather, come up with a title that is descriptive of the content being presented. Use a reference management tool whenever you're doing research of any size. You can use Word's built-in references management if you wish to. It's not bad. It's better than nothing, but it's not as good as something like EndNote or Zotero. So EndNote, fantastic tool, but it's not free. You have to pay for it. Zotero, a free alternative to EndNote. It's not EndNote. It's still very good, don't get me wrong. It's just not EndNote. Both of those integrate inside of with Word so that you can do citations as you're writing, and both of them have the ability to import RIS or EndNote files from things like Google Scholar or your various libraries. And then both tools will allow you to essentially keep track of notes about the research that you have. This becomes more important, especially if you're moving into something like a dissertation where you want to keep track of a large amount of information. Flagging them, putting notes on what is good and what is not, using them in folders and such to organize them becomes critical in that sort of situation. Next, you go to your library, and unlike the old days where you actually had to go to the library, here you open up your favorite browser, go to your university library, or go to scholar.google.com. You can also link scholar.google.com or Google Scholar to your local library's resources, so you can kind of go there to get things that it finds. A key part of any kind of research is coming up with the search terms. Once you've identified terms that work, you may want to keep them in a notebook somewhere, especially if it's a larger sort of experience. The reason being, coming up with the words for things, the succinct keywords, is oftentimes part of the biggest challenge of doing research, is finding the words that is what it is you have in your mind so that you can actually find the articles. Generally speaking, you want publications that are less than 5 years old, but it kind of depends. It depends on if the work that you're citing is the seminal source or not. So if it's the first time something was proposed or discussed, go to the original source. Don't go to something that's a secondary source. Doing secondary citations is not a good thing. Another thing is to utilize a Word template. If you go to the Colorado Technical University, you want to use CTU's template. It is excellent. The things that templates bring to the table is that it takes care of all the stuff that you would have to do yourself for you. Things like getting the fonts right, the indentation right, the paragraphs, the head or the sections right, all that kind of stuff. Is part of what they bring to the table. Making sure your margins are 1 inch, all that good stuff. Making sure you have a hanging indent on your citations, all that. Generally speaking, you'll want to use the professional version of a template if you're a graduate student. There are exceptions in some universities, but generally speaking, if you're an undergraduate, that's the person who should be using the student APA 7th template or style. If you're a graduate student, typically you want to be using the professional. Obviously check with your instructor to make sure that it's the right sort of thing, but that's what it is at most universities. Again, whenever you introduce the introduction on the first page of content, do not include an introduction heading. I say that a lot, and I still see introduction headings. So don't do it. And then the last thing is you have a short version of your title that becomes the running head in the professional version. So here's what it looks like. You'll notice upper right-hand corner is the page number. Upper left-hand corner is the running head or running header. In APA 6th, we had the words running head in front of it with a colon at the end. We no longer do that. You'll look down a little bit. You see that the title of the paper is on the title page. Go figure. Bold and centered, a little bit of space between it and the student's name, and then the university that you're affiliated with, or institution that you're affiliated with. That is the APA 7th professional title page. Nothing else. No other things are needed unless your instructor were to tell you that there's something else they need. But if you're following the APA standard, this is what it looks like. As a general rule, don't do an abstract unless one is explicitly requested by your instructor. There's several reasons for that. First of all, they're kind of hard to do. It's not just a summary of your paper, but rather it's something that stands on its own, that talks about exactly what is in the paper and what the findings of it are as well. So it's a little more challenging. But don't do one unless you're asked for it. It should be one paragraph with no indentation. If you have keywords, they'll go on this page as well. When you look at the content inside of your paper, make sure that the special setting on each of the paragraphs is first line and the line spacing is double, and that everything is left aligned. APA is left aligned. There's no full alignment. It may look prettier, but you may think it looks better, but APA is not necessarily pretty. It's meant to be standardized and follow a certain pattern. So make sure that you do so. Don't go and make it better. I did that on my first APA submission, and whenever I entered a doctoral program, it came back really red. So don't do that. Here's another example, kind of filled in a little bit more. What I've done here is put my headings inside of the paper. Again, notice no introduction heading, but there is where I've made a note to myself that the introduction goes right after the title, and that title should match exactly what's on your title page, no variations. Also, note that the conclusion is the very last thing. So this is where I typically start, and then my next step is to fill this in. I do that by going to the library and doing some research. I start searching for keywords. When I find an article, I typically use the export function at the bottom inside of Google Scholar. Click on those double quotes and then export it to EndNote. What that does is downloads an RS file that I can then pull into EndNote, and then I can also attach a PDF to that as well, so that you're able to not only have the source that you're using, but the actual text of the source so you can review it later. Really, really important whenever you're doing something like a doctorate and following a dissertation or doing a research paper of some magnitude. So it's always a good idea to save them, because sometimes it's hard to find them again. Especially whenever you're dealing with university libraries, there's always a chance that a certain collection might not be there tomorrow. So make sure that you save it for your records. Typically, next the step is to review the publication. I do this by taking a look at the abstract. I typically will also read over the introduction. I take a look then by usually flipping to the conclusions or findings. And then if it's still looking good, then I start looking for more, like what I can pull from a particular source. But the key concept with citations, and this is often overlooked, is that you should only cite what is new to that article. So don't cite something out of their literature review, because that's secondary citations. You should go to the original source, unless they're weaving together a story in their literature review that is unique to that paper. So if they basically cite articles A, B, and C, and then make some conclusion based upon that, it's okay to cite the conclusion, but don't cite something that's being repeated from article A or B or C. Here's an example of an article to review. Notice the abstract. I've highlighted the thesis statement. It's pretty easy to see. And generally speaking, you give the reader a hint by saying this paper. You start with that sentence. It gives the reader a pretty good hint as to what is the point of this paper, so they can zoom in on it and then determine if it's applicable to what they're looking for. The conclusion also restates the thesis statement, and it talks about what was learned through the experience. I generally highlight things, just as you see in this paper, in EndNote, to keep track of what I think is important. Then, once I've written a paragraph, I go into the paper and insert the citation. I typically do so by selecting, getting my cursor where it needs to be in Word, switching over to EndNote, picking the article I'm interested in, and do it from the EndNote side of things. You can do the same thing from Word. I found that to be a few less clicks. You also may want to take a look at what it's producing on the inserted reference. It is possible to fix that to where it will be double spaced. It's a discussion beyond this, but if you Google something like double spaced references inside of it, you can find it. Here's an example of a paragraph from the source. Not the most riveting thing you'll ever read, but it's adequate. I also make sure that you do things like define any acronyms that are being used. APA manual says if they're in the dictionary that it's okay to use them. I personally generally spell them out regardless, because there's always a chance of collision on acronyms. There's tons of things in this field. So that's what I typically do. Do cite on the first sentence that uses the source. That may or may not be the first sentence in the paragraph. Depends upon your writing style. And whatever you do, don't make a copy of the original stuff and do synonym replacement, because it's really hard to read and it's plagiarism. So just don't do that. So when you're writing a paragraph, the first sentence is basically the point. It is the topic sentence. It may or may not have a citation on it. Depends upon how you're writing. If you make a claim, then you should include a citation to reinforce where you got that information. Strictly speaking, you probably shouldn't be making too many claims, because a claim is going to be evidence, and evidence typically is after the thesis statement. But if for some reason you do, make sure that you include a citation. Make sure you do include any kind of citations on subsequent sentences where you may be using a different source. So to avoid overcitation, which is whenever somebody cites basically more than they need to, you should only cite whenever it's about removing ambiguity. So if you are in one paragraph and you cite on one sentence, and the second sentence after that comes from the same source, you don't need another citation. But if you were to introduce another source, a different source, so your first sentence has one source, the second sentence has a different source, and the third sentence is the first source, you need to cite all three of those appropriately. But that's the only reason or only situation you do that. And don't do overcitation. It's really ugly, and your teacher will appreciate it if you don't. And basically, whenever I do this, I go out, I do some searching in the library, I find some source, I do some reading, I pull what's important from that particular source into a readable format, cite it appropriately, and keep going until basically I filled up my paper. So the order you read things, it depends upon what you do, but generally speaking, journal articles are never read front to end. You typically kind of jump around. You may read the abstract, the conclusion, maybe the introduction, then you may jump down to the method or the findings. You jump around depending upon what it is. You almost never read it all. Unless it's something that is brand new to you and you're unfamiliar with the field, then you may actually go to the trouble of reading like the literature review. But once you get past a certain level, you don't read it all. Whenever you're looking at a source, try to determine if it's a good source or not. And what's good? Well, it kind of depends. First of all, if you see typos, misspellings, anything like that, formatting issues, probably not a good source. The reason being, that stuff should get caught during peer review. If it's not caught during peer review, maybe it's not being really peer reviewed. And if it's not peer reviewed, then you shouldn't be using it. What does peer reviewed mean? Well, it went through a process where more than one, generally speaking, individuals that are experts in the field took a look at an article, often blind, so they don't know who the author is, and make notes about the content of the paper, kick it back. The author then revises it to address those comments, and so on. The idea is that it has been vetted by a peer of experts, and so it is viewed to be valid, versus somebody's opinion, which is published on their blog, which has no peer review process at all. It's just an opinion. And that's a key thing to understand with scholarly writing. It's not about your opinion, it's about the facts that you can show and the arguments that you can make based upon those facts. And then basically that's what I look for. Is the methodology of it good? Is the authors, are they associated with a reasonable institution? Is it pretty well written? Can I find the point of what they're writing without having to do it? If it's a mystery novel, I'm not going to use it. So it should be relatively easy to find the sources, find the information that you're looking for, find the point that they're making, and so on. So then what goes in your introduction? And as I mentioned before, it should have a thesis statement. It may want to establish the context to get the reader's attention and get them centered into the domain that you're going to be talking about. Maybe not, depends upon the paper and the type of topic that you're writing about. Generally speaking, you also want to include the subtopics that are going to be utilized to support the thesis statement. Those basically correspond to the outline heading level 1s in your paper. If you make a claim, which you may or may not need to, you better cite it. So if you just basically outline what you're going to talk about, there's no need for a citation in your introduction. Most of the time, there isn't a citation in an introduction, not if it's pretty well written. That said, if somebody wants to establish relevance and importance of a topic, a citation is appropriate, especially if they're making a claim about how big something is. Here's an example of an introduction. Probably not the most riveting thing you'll ever read, but it is sufficient. It does include a thesis statement. It does enumerate the subtopics. And this is basically all you need for an introduction. It sets the stage, lets somebody know what we're talking about and what we're going to talk about. So it serves as a roadmap. Then the next question, what goes in the conclusion? As I mentioned previously, it's a restatement of the thesis statement, generally speaking in past tense, and also the subtopics are generally expressed in past tense. But that's a style issue. It's up to you. You may want to also identify the important topics to take away from the paper, but a key thing here is to not introduce anything new. This is not a discussion section. This is, I'm wrapping it up. You don't do the and one more thing in this section. Instead, this is simply to summarize what you've done, show that you've done what you said you were going to do in the thesis statement in the introduction, and basically to wrap it up in a smooth way. Generally speaking, no citations, because if you're introducing a citation, you're introducing a claim that is new, not the place for it to go. It should go someplace else, maybe a discussion section. The importance of a conclusion is it's similar to when you're on the phone talking to someone. Generally speaking, we say, hey, I got to go, or something to give them an indication the conversation is completing. It's rather jarring to read a paper with no conclusion because you're reading a narrative and then it stops. So always include a conclusion. It doesn't have to be really that exhaustive. This is a sufficient conclusion. It restates the thesis statement. It talks about the topics that were discussed, and then it gives a high-level takeaway. And that's literally all that's required. So when do you do what? And it depends is the short answer. And even within myself, I find that I do different things depending upon the complexity of the paper I'm writing. So if I'm writing something that is potentially fluid, so not so much a assignment, but maybe something I'm interested in, I'm probably not going to write the introduction and conclusion until I'm nearly done. The reason being is I may introduce some additional subtopics. I know what my thesis statement is. You kind of have to know that before you start to write, but you may not necessarily know exactly what the subtopics are or the order in which you do them. So it's to some extent giving you some flexibility so that you don't have to rewrite your introduction and conclusion if you decide you need maybe a fourth bullet point in your outline. But it's really up to the individual writer. And so that's basically the thing. Very rarely do you write introduction, body, conclusion. Could happen, but very unlikely. The next step in the process for me is to run Grammarly. Even if I think I'm a halfway decent writer, Grammarly always finds a way to encourage me to be better. So it catches not only misspellings, but also things like the wrong word, or when you need a comma or don't need a comma, or maybe some other sort of variances, such as whenever using the word this, you'll get an unclear antecedent error a lot of the time if you don't say what this is. One of the key things to keep in mind with Grammarly is, yes, it will catch all of your mistakes, or, well, a lot of them. It is a tool. It's an aid. It's not always 100% right, but if it flags something, you probably want to look at it, even if what it's saying isn't necessarily correct, because it could be that it's something that's a little unusual. Also, don't take too much concern with things like passive voice. Depending upon your writing style and what it is you're writing about, you may drop into passive voice. APA 7th does allow first person, as 6 did, but generally speaking, a lot of institutions aren't that great about it. In the case of CTU, it is acceptable to use first person, but be cautious of when you use it and make sure you're using it appropriately. If you're wanting to attribute some action to someone, then it's appropriate. Don't use it as an opportunity to express an opinion, because as I've said before, opinions have no place in scholarly writing. The next step is to go through, do some cleanup, make sure everything is in the same font. You may have issues with, especially with EndNote sometimes, and if your template is a different font than Times New Roman, you may end up with Times New Roman in your references section. Make sure that your references are correct as well, because EndNote is a tool like any other tool that if you gave it bad information when you added the reference, then you will get bad information out. So double check that it is in line with what the APA says the various formatting should be for the type of article or journal article or whatever publication it is you're using. Make sure everything is double spaced. Make sure that your references are on a separate page. Make sure there's not a blank page after or between the end of the paper and the references. Just basically clean up, right? And make sure you do have the same font throughout the paper. Yes, APA 7th does allow you to do different fonts, but not in the same paper. So pick one and stick with it. So in summary, here are the things that I've talked about. I've talked about the importance of a thesis statement, and make sure that you have one, because without a good thesis statement, it's really hard to write a decent paper. The other is to make sure that you cover all the requirements in the assignment. That sounds like a common sense sort of thing, but you'd be amazed at how many students and graduate students omit some significant portion of their assignment because they didn't transfer it over to either an outline or to their paper. You do want to use a template because it will make your life easier. You may want to create an outline and convert it to headings, or you may just want to go straight to heading level 1s for your outline and use heading level 2s and 3s if they're appropriate. Repeat the cycle or the process of research, read, and review, and then write and cite. Once you've done all that and you filled out your paper, then I typically write my introduction and conclusion, and if I'm required to do an abstract, it is the last thing I write. And with that, I conclude this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know. I'll talk with you later.